Awesome. All righty, I'm Paige, and let's rock and roll. So we're going to just do a quick review of what we covered last week, and what we covered last week was on page 47. And where we left off was almost the very bottom paragraph. So the paragraph that we would be starting is almost at the bottom when it on page 47 when it says, "That was great news for us." But I think it might be helpful to just do a very quick review of the paragraph above it. And that paragraph above is going to lead us onto a little tangent back to the back of the book, which is a fun, delightful adventure that let's all go on together. So going up a paragraph, we needed to ask ourselves about one short question. And if you were here 2 weeks ago when we covered this, you'll have a little note in your book that says Step 2, Part 1. Because this is the first part to step 2. And here it is. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe that there is a power? And notice that P is capitalized, power greater than myself. And I can ask myself that question. Do I believe, or am I even willing to believe that there is, or that there could be a power greater than myself? And if I am able to say, yes, there is probably a power greater than myself, heck yeah. That's step 2, part 1. That's it. Because step 2, as it's written on page 59, says came to believe that a power greater than ourselves, not in. So first and foremost, I got to believe that power greater than myself exists. And that's going to be step 2, part 1. Then it's going to say could restore us to sanity. Spoilers, that'll be step 2, part 2. And it says as soon as a man can say he does believe or is willing to believe, we emphatically, with emphasis, like rock and roll, like well, emphasis isn't really enthusiasm, but I feel like enthusiasm does help emphasis, and they both start with E. So how could that be wrong? Anywho, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. So if I keep in mind, step 2 is not the finish line. When I came to the rooms of 12 step, man, I kind of thought, I assumed I had to have step 2 locked down. I often make that joke that I thought I had to walk hand in hand on the beach with God. Now, there's a couple barriers to that. I live in a province known as Alberta. It's quite landlocked. We don't have beaches. How the heck would I be doing that anywhere? You know what I mean? Especially at step 2. You see, step 2 is just believing that there is a power. I don't need to know this power. I don't need to like this power. I sure as heck don't need to understand this power, but can I believe this power exists? And starting from this point, am I willing to take actions which will allow me to get to know and to relate and to utilize this power? So that's what it means when it says we are on our way. We're not done. Cool, step 2, I'm done with this whole conception of a power greater than myself. No, we're going to grow from here. So it says it has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, wonderfully effective, and that's what we're here to do, build something effective, something that works, right? And upon this idea of there could be a power greater than me, keep in mind, I just admitted my alcoholism or my addiction or my codependency or my whatever brings you to the study was a power greater than me, but could I believe there's another one? You know what I mean? Upon that, we're going to build an effective spiritual structure. We've got to continue building. And that cornerstone is that stone that is symbolically laid upon which the whole structure is built upon. All right. And then we got this little asterisk. And this little asterisk says, please be sure to read Appendix 2 on spiritual experience. And this is the only time in any of the asterisks that tells us that says please. It's like be sure to, or have a look at, or read, you know, but this time it said please. So this time, because it asked us nicely, we'll pop to the back and have a look at that spiritual appendix. I always like doing it there because I think that's funny. So where we're gonna pop over to is page 567. And the spiritual appendix, page 567, this was added between the forward to the first edition. So after the forward to the first edition, this was added in the forward to the second edition. So this was added at this point. And so spiritual experience, appendix 2, page 567. I'm just saying it a couple times so everybody has time to get there. I don't want anyone to feel rushed. All right, it says the terms spiritual experience and spiritual awakening are used many times in this book, which upon careful reading shows that the personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism has manifested itself among us in many different forms. And so it's kind of implicit to me that it's saying spiritual experience and spiritual awakening are synonyms, just words that mean the same. Hey, welcome, glad you're here. I love your bird behind you. I think that's rad, and I could not say it. Sorry, everyone here is rad, whether you have a bird painting behind you or not. I'm just glad you're here. And by the way, we're on page 567, spiritual experience. But I think when it's referring to that, what they're saying is it's a synonym, a word that means the same thing. Spiritual awakening, spiritual experience, entire psychic change, essentially meaning the same thing. And I think that can be really useful just to keep it simple so I'm not overthinking it. But there are people that I know of that differentiate the two, spiritual awakening and spiritual experience. For some people, the idea of a spiritual experience is that past moment, like Bill had a spiritual experience, where a lot of us have an awakening, something that happens a little bit more gradually. I don't have an opinion. I just want to give you all that information so you can decide how you want to differentiate, if you want to or not. Believe me, I will pick my hills to die on, and that is not that hill. So off we go. All right. And so that, and that's what we're after. And when it talks about the personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism, in the doctor's opinion, the spiritual awakening is referred to as an entire psychic change. So the word psychic, the root of that word means of mind and soul. So what I need is a change of my mind and of my soul. Oh, and Scott's got some people who know so hold on, I gotta scroll a little. Scott says he knows some people see it spiritual experience, sometimes quickly, spiritual awakening, sometimes slowly. I think what's important to remember is it'll always materialize if we work for it. Tied it in, night set promises. Also, if you're new to this study, if you put things in the chat, I will get derailed. So have fun. That's an invitation. Alrighty, so that change of mind and soul. Oh gosh, there's another one. We got it literally. An awakening. Oh, that was all. An awakening of the spirit. Yeah, that spirit coming alive. That spirit that was once asleep, waking up. That change of my mind and that change of my soul. But that change that happens in me, that happens to me, that is necessary to produce recovery from alcoholism. That's what we're talking about. And it says, yet it is true that our first printing gave many readers that the impression that these personality changes or religious experiences must be in the nature of sudden and spectacular upheavals. So these dramatic changes. If you guys remember Bill Wilson, his experience, right? He had that white light spiritual awakening. Actually, it's a spiritual awakening type that was referenced in William James's book, which was known as the luminous variety. So where there's a white light. Yeah, welcome. We're on page 567. I'm glad you're here. So that's a type of spiritual awakening that was regularly recorded throughout history. And we will read Fitzmayo's spiritual awakening, his powerful, profound, who are you to say there is no God moment. And we can read things like that and think, man, that hasn't happened to me. And it goes on to say, happily for everyone, this conclusion is erroneous. Erroneous, that means incorrect, but also, listen, it's a great word. Take it, put it in your pocket, use it. You know what I mean? You drive through Timmy's and you're like, unfortunately, the order is erroneous. You know what? I just, it's such a good word. I love throwing in old big book words into modern language. It's my favorite. I'm so much fun at parties. All right, so what it's saying is that that's not everybody's experience. But as we go through this, what I really want to encourage us is to not sell the power of God or to sell the power of these 12 steps short. Because I don't know about you. I've gone to some of those meetings where it's a little, when everyone's a little dry, you know what I mean by dry, and everyone's a little miserable, and you kind of hear, maybe we're reading this part of the book, or maybe we're reading Bill's part of the book or Fitz's part of the book, and you kind of hear this thing like, well, you can't expect to have a spiritual awakening like that. Nonsense. nonsense, and with everything that is in me, nonsense. Like, that is an old idea. Let's get rid of that idea. See, I don't know about you. I couldn't stay well on one drink. I couldn't stay well on one hoot of crack. I couldn't stay well on one pill. I can't stay well on one experience. So I don't want to limit that power, which is God, or that power which happens as the result of these 12 steps. I don't want to limit that. Who am I to say what sort of awakening that I need or experience that I need? But I know I need to continue to seek. So if I have not had a profound spiritual awakening like Bill, well, let's keep going. We got to anyways. You know what I mean? So it says so when it says in the first few chapters, a number of sudden revolutionary changes are described. And that's what we're talking about, that change in who I am. And it says, though it was not our intention to create such an impression, many have nevertheless concluded that in order to recover, there's that word again, recover, like recovered, they must acquire an immediate and overwhelming God consciousnness, followed at once by a vast change in feeling and outlook. So this sudden, all right, now I'm walking hand on hand on the beach with God. Like that's, you know, you read it and you think that. And what it's saying is, no, not that, but there are elements of the spiritual awakening. That idea of having a God consciousness, a with knowing of this power, and a change in my feeling and my outlook. Those are elements. So I can look at my experience. Have I had those elements? Am I beginning to have those elements? Maybe it hasn't been the lightning bolt, but is it happening? And it says, among our rapidly growing membership of thousands, keep in mind, this one came out in 55, of alcoholics, such transformations, though frequent. So again, I don't want to say, hey, this can't happen. We don't want to downplay this experience. Man, this thing can and will and does, and today does happen, though frequent. Are by no means the rule. You know what I mean? We have a variety of them. Ooh, variety of religious experiences. That would be a good name for a book. That is a joke that I'm going to tie in here in a little bit. Most of our experiences are what the psychologist William James calls the educational variety, because they develop slowly over a period of time. And so it's referencing William James and his book, Varieties of Religious Experience. Oh, yeah. So if you're wondering, if you look at Pinto Pete, has a copy of that. That is a delightful cover. Anywho. And I want y'all to know, I love that book. And it is not known for being a fun, lighthearted read. It's kind of known for being a little wordy, a little verbose. The language is perhaps a tad antiquated. But man, I love that book. And you know what got me to have, and I don't read well, I listen to it on an audiobook format. But what got me to pick up that book was I was at a meeting and somebody told me, did you know in William James's book, there is no educational variety that is described. It's not in there. That phrase, educational variety, is not used. And man, you can't tell somebody like me a piece of information like that. I'm like a dog with a bone. I gotta go. And so, oh man, I also want to tell you what I found, because I kind of want you to have your own experience, but I'll share it with you. Yeah, the words educational variety I could not find in the book Varieties of Religious Experience. It does talk about ones that happen a little bit more slowly over time. It does reference that, but that phrase isn't used, which I think is fun and delightful. Maybe that's just the nerd in me coming out. But William James, his book is actually a series of lectures that he gave when he was over in Scotland, and describing this, you know, he said religious experiences because commonly that's what it would be associated with, but he means these sudden spectacular upheavals. Most of whom that he looked at were sudden, because he's like, man, if I'm going to study something, I'm going to study the big stuff. You know, I'm going to go with the, you know, it's kind of like if I'm going to go for a drink, I'm going to go for a drink. I'm not settling for that like low alcohol content nonsense. I'm going for the good stuff. And so that was like, he was like, I'm going to study the good stuff. So he talks about he does talk about ones that do develop slowly over time, but it's not a main part of the book. Yeah, and if you're interested, it's available. I really enjoyed it because it tied together a lot of things. And it tied together for me a lot of different meditative practices that were around in the 1930s and were readily used, maybe not by Oxford group members, but were readily used in that era. And it just love it. And it just it just loved, you know, when things just fall into place, things just fell into place for me. So I got a soft spot for that, William James and his varieties of religious experiences. And I'm going to talk about some of that in a little bit, but it says quite often, and oh, actually one of the things with educational variety, why I'm kind of like, hey, we also got to be careful as we read this, because often I can confuse educational variety with intellectual variety. Do you know what I'm saying? You see, these 12 steps are not things that I can, well, of course I can intellectualize. I can intellectualize anything and everything, you know, especially to avoid having to do the work. But these 12 steps are not an intellectual exercise. Educational is absolutely a beautiful way to describe it because it is learning through experience. That's what we're doing. We're trying to take the actions of these steps to experience this power and not get stuck up in here in what I think about the steps or what I know about the steps. It is about the actions that I take of the steps that allow me to experience this thing. So I always caution avoiding falling into the intellectualizing of this stuff. I say that as somebody who's like, woo, William James, what a fun read that was. I'm aware of the hypocrisy. I'm aware. All right. So it says quite often friends of the newcomer are aware of the difference long before he is himself. And so here is what we experience. And so you can make a little note. This is the first thing that we often experience. He finally realizes that he has undergone a profound alteration in his reaction to life. So the way that I react to life, the way that I see life when life happens, you know, we often joke life on life's terms. How cool is it to flip that and say life on God's terms or higher power's terms or creator's terms, right? But how I'm showing up is different. Two, that this is the second part, that such a change could hardly have been brought about by himself alone. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not criticizing therapy or counseling. That's so very important, that outside help. But man, I did a lot of therapy, a lot of counseling before I came to 12-step. And I took a lot of different medications, very rarely as prescribed, I will give them that. But and there was not any sort of profound change. And I threw myself at a lot of different things, and there was a lot of different things that didn't work. But I did this, and this was a change, and it's like I couldn't have done this in and of myself. And then it says 3. You don't have, I'm like, for me, 3 is like a third idea of the spiritual awakening. What often takes place in a few months, and that's on the longer side of taking to work the steps or do the steps or take the actions of the steps. You know what I mean? A few months is a little bit longer than we normally reference. So a few months could seldom, which means rarely, have been accomplished by years of self-discipline. So the change doesn't take long, in the sense of it doesn't take long to have this spiritual awakening, this spiritual experience. But man, I couldn't have done it on my own, trying on my own. It wouldn't have worked. And then this is the 4th idea. With few exceptions, our members find that they have tapped an unsuspected inner resource. And I love that idea of an inner resource. Oftentimes in this book, we talk about one of the places in which God resides is within our heart. And what that looks like is, you know, when you show up to a situation that you would normally filled with rage or fear or anger, and there's something different that flows through you. Peace, compassion, kindness, this ability to show up to life. Man, that's what it looks like in my life. And I share these things, what it looks like in my life, because often for me, I wanted to intellectualize it and I wanted to understand it and hear before I could take the actions. But again, I got to take the actions before I get the understanding, because I got to experience it. So this unsuspected inner resource, and by the way, I love unsuspected, because I take the steps and it's like, whoa, there's a change. You know what I mean? Who would have thought? Everyone in the meeting was telling me to do it and the result would be this, but who would have thought it would happen? You know, isn't that kind of how we experience it? And it says, in a resource which they presently identify with their own conception of a capital P power greater than themselves. Most of us think this awareness of a capital P power greater than ourselves is the essence of a spiritual experience. Our more religious members call it God consciousness. Now, keep in mind that word conscious means with knowing. With knowing, having that knowing of a power greater than ourselves. That's what we're talking about. Goes on to say most emphatically, hey, let's put some emphasis again, right? We wish to say that any alcoholic capable of honestly facing his problems in the light of our own experience can recover, provided he does not close his mind to all spiritual concepts. He can only be defeated. What an interesting idea. What will defeat me in this process? This is the only thing that will defeat me. By an attitude of intolerance or belligerent denial. That's what can throw me off with this whole idea of a conception of a power greater than myself. And it says we find that no one, and I mean, feel free to highlight, underline, no one need have difficulty with the spirituality of the program. Willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness are the essentials of recovery, but these are indispensable. We need these. These don't go away. I need to remain open and willing and honest. And Abby Thatcher told Bill it was actually humility, honesty, and open-mindedness, or and willingness, like that idea of humility being a part of this. Now, it goes on to say, there is a principle which is bar against all information. That idea, we have this idea that will like keep us closed to all information, which is proof against all arguments, that we can just use in any argument, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation. And what that idea is saying is that idea of coming to something with the idea of, yeah, I know that. I know the steps won't work for me. I'm not a God person. I can't meditate. I can't, you know what I mean? I can't do it. I can't make that amends. I know what's going to happen. That's what that looks like. Keep in mind, I haven't done it. I haven't had any experience with it, but I'm sure it will not work. So my closed mind is the thing that will keep me in everlasting ignorance, which will keep me in the darkness, which will get me drunk. I cannot have a new experience based on a closed mind. Now it goes on to say Herbert Spencer. And what's interesting is this is absolutely not a Herbert Spencer quote, although Herbert Spencer is often and regularly quoted and referenced in Varieties of Religious Experiences. Fun. If you're here and you're new and you're like, oh God, don't worry, next week will be not much different, actually, if I'm completely honest with you, but keep coming back anyways. And so this quote should be attributed to William Paley. And William Paley, he was an English clergyman, an author, and a lecturer. And he, like, I don't know if this is interesting for some of you, but he lived from 1743 to 1805, just to kind of put him in history if you got a brain for that. And so you might be wondering, hey, they got a misquote? Where the heck did this misquote come from? Well, there's this artist in Alcoholics Anonymous. His name was Ray C. And he designed, if you've ever seen the first edition cover, that it's kind of known as the circus cover, like that first edition with the red. And actually, a lot of the big book compendium stuff is kind of designed after that. The red and the yellow, and it's got the circle right in the middle. That was designed by Ray C. He also designed this cover of the first edition that wasn't used, but it was an Art Deco style. That's just kind of fun if you're interested in that sort of nerdy stuff. If you're interested in no nerdy stuff, I'm sure this has been quite painful for you, and I apologize. And his story was in the first edition. It was called An Artist's Concept. And his story wasn't carried over to the second edition, but that quote was in his story, and that misquote was in his story, and that misquote was carried over into the Spiritual Experience Appendix. And so one of the things I just kind of wanted to share for those that, and maybe, well, whatever, for those that are interested, William James, he describes some elements of a spiritual awakening, a spiritual experience. And I think some of them are just really interesting. And there's 4. And they're fun words that I would love for you guys to put in your pocket and bring out in casual conversation. It's too bad the holidays are over, because this would be great for any family time, you know? So the 4 qualities of a spiritual experience from William James's book. The first quality is that it is ineffable. Which, again, right? Oh, ineffable. It speaks for itself. We all know what that means. So I absolutely did not. Ineffable, which means it's something that cannot be described. It is something that must be experienced to be understood. Doesn't that make sense? When you come to the rooms and you hear things that are, it sounds like the stupidest thing you've ever heard coming out of the stupidest person you ever thought's mouth, but then you experience it and you're like, oh, you know what I mean? It's ineffable. It needs ineffable. It means it needs to be experienced to be understood. The other quality of the 4 qualities is that it is noetic. And noetic, what that, I mean, huta, noetic, we all know what that means. None of us had to Google. I had to Google, you all knew. Noetic, it means that that the experience itself reveals divine truths. These things that were true that we couldn't have known otherwise. And oh, Rob's got some interesting stuff in the chat. I don't think I have time to go over it, but oh, it's exciting over there. And then the experience itself is transient in nature. So there's a limited duration, but the effects of it remain. There are these lasting effects. Now, keep in mind, if I stop doing the work, that those effects will continue to dwindle. The 4th quality of a spiritual experience is passivity. And what that means is I'm not able to control when it comes and when it goes. I can't just magically be like, okay, God, higher power, creator, spirit of the universe, let's have a spiritual awakening, rock and roll, let's go. It happens to me. But what we can do is we create fertile ground where one does inevitably happen through working the 12 steps. So, and if you're like, whoa, that was a lot. Those are a lot of really big words. Don't you worry. As we rock and roll back into the chapter, We Agnostics, and this is why I love finding sneaky descriptions of the spiritual awakening as we go through We Agnostics, and really all throughout the book. Because if some of that feels a little wordy or a little like, man, I don't understand what we're talking about, it becomes really clear as we go through the book. So let's pop back to page 47. Hopefully that was helpful. And let's go back to not the very bottom paragraph, but right after our cornerstone, right after our second step question. It goes on to say, this was great news for us. So that idea of like where we're not starting with the ineffable experience of God. Where we're starting is, okay, I believe that Paige and Rob and some of the people that come to the study have better things to do than show up on a Monday and lie about their experiences. Maybe there's a higher power. That's where we're starting. And it says, that was great news for us. This as a starting place, great news. For we had assumed that we could not make use of spiritual principles. Now, what I've come to really find is that the spiritual principles are not vague, nebulous ideas. They are the concrete actions of the 12 steps, which made, it's like, how do I practice courage or faith or hope? I gotta take actions. So that made things just fall into place for me as well. So we could not make use of spiritual principles. So that idea, we assumed we could not do the steps unless we accepted many things on faith, which seemed difficult to believe. Like that idea, I thought I had to have a spiritual awakening to do the steps. That's genuinely what I believed. I thought I had to know God to take these actions. No, I take these actions to have a spiritual experience. That's what it's talking about. And that idea, you don't have to believe the stuff I believe. You don't have to think the way that I think. You can find William James quite dull. That is okay. Believe me, you can never read that book, never look at that book, never be excited about that, and still stay sober. Woo, which is great news because I get it. It can be a little dry. So It says, when people presented us with spiritual approaches, how frequently did we all say, I wish I had what that man has. I'm sure it could work if I could only believe as he believes, but I cannot accept as surely true the many articles of faith which are so plain to him. And an article of faith would be like the doctrines or the beliefs of a certain religious sect or any religion, right? It's that if you've ever seen, maybe you had a healthy, somebody who was in your life who had a healthy spirituality, a healthy religious practice, and you're like, man, I wish I could be as calm and centered as Aunt Carol. Or you have a friend that has who's a Buddhist, and they just show up and they're so calm, but it's like, man, but I'm not down for that religion, or I'm not down for that faith. And what we're saying is that is okay. You don't have to be. That's good news. That is good news. And it says, so it was comforting to learn that we could commence at a simpler level. Where we need to start is simply, could there be a power greater than myself? Is it, and I love saying it like this, is it possible that all those sober jerks are not lying about their experience? If I can believe those stupid jerks with their stupid highlighters at their stupid big book study aren't lying about their experience, step 2, part 1. Actually, to be honest, that's step 2, part. I mean, that's all step 2. You're good to go. That's spoilers for next week. Anywho, so it says, besides a seeming inability to accept much on faith, we often found ourselves handicapped by obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. And as we go through the book, especially as we're going through step 1, what we would do is ask ourselves, is this my experience? Okay, once I start to drink, do I lose control? Is that my experience? But as we approach the second step, we can ask ourselves, some of these barriers to belief in the power greater than ourselves, is this my experience? So as I'm approaching that idea of, could there be a power greater than myself? Did I found myself handicapped, so held back by obstinacy, which obstinacy is, yeah, Rob's got it. It's essentially stubbornness. That idea of inflexible, stubbornness, persistent, self-will, like I got these old ideas of what it needs to look like, and it's not working. Sensitiveness. Now, sensitiveness does not mean, you know, those Thai insurance commercials that would just pull at your hearts? Maybe you don't. Or like a dog food commercial, you got like a sad little puppy or something. That's not what we're talking about with sensitiveness. Sensitiveness is when we come to like a meeting and like people are talking and we assume they're talking about me. I'm sure no one relates. I know, I can't hear what they're saying, but I know for sure they're saying bad things. That's what we're talking about, sensitiveness. I'm taking things personally, and I really apologize because I am going to ruin your day, because it was ruined for me. Because I used to joke, oh, I'm sensitive. And somebody pointed out, Paige, sensitive is just a synonym for self-centered. Oh, it ruined my day. Very helpful to know. See, when I'm personalizing it, when I'm making it about me, when I'm sensitive, I'm in self and I'm self-centered, right? And do I show up to things like to this idea of God sensitive? And maybe I got, and we've kind of talked about, and we'll continue to talk about, man, I've had some bad things happen. I'm sensitive, fair enough. But has this not been a barrier? And it says unreasoning prejudice. Now, that idea of prejudice is to have an idea about something which I've had no experience, that old idea, this unreasoning prejudice. And it says many of us have been so touchy, that sensitive, that even casual reference to spiritual things made us bristle with antagonism. Bristle is to be filled with, and that antagonism is in the 1930s dictionary, it says, come fight me, bro. That's not what it says. I'm joking. But that like antagonism, like I want to fight and I'm angry and I want to argue. You know what I mean? Has that not been my experience? You know, I hear people talk about God and I'm like, I assume I know what they mean, and I get angry, and I'm like, oh, you shouldn't talk like, you know, is that my experience? Has that been my experience? And you see, the book is going to meet us where we're at. If that is, that's okay. This is how we begin to work through it. Now, it does say this sort of thinking had to be abandoned. So we have to let go of this type of thinking absolutely and completely. No strings attached. It is abandoned. Though some of us resisted, We found no great difficulty casting aside such feelings. And here's why. Here's how we're able to lay aside those old ideas, to come and seek a new experience. Faced with alcoholic destruction, oh, right. I had my butt absolutely handed to me by this illness. And you see, often if I'm struggling with something like a step 2, or I'm struggling with a 4, or I'm struggling with amends, often what it is a step 1 problem. I'm not convinced that I have this illness. I'm not convinced that unless I have a spiritual awakening, I am going to drink again or use again. So it says, faced with alcoholic destruction, we soon became as open-minded on spiritual matters as we had tried to be on other questions. In this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be prejudiced for as long as some of us were. See, my job is not to definitely listen. I know my book is hardcover, but it's not hardcover so I can beat my sponsees into their second step. That's not what we do. We use our words. But also that's not my job. My job is to show up with God's light and God's power, and this power working through me that is not of my own. And my job is to show up with these tools and offer them to those that want it. In the 12 and 12, I believe it's tradition 9, it talks about how great love and great suffering are our only disciplinarians. We need no others. I'm not in the great suffering department. That is alcoholism's job, or addiction's job, or codependency's job, or the job of the manifestation of the illness that brings you to this all-inclusive study today. That is not my job. My job is great love, to be kind, to be honest, and to offer this way of life. And that's why step 1, it's so important for me to have that understanding. I will relapse. That is step 1. Because man, if I am convinced of that idea of like, okay, maybe there's a power greater than myself that seems to work for you, I'm grabbing a hold of it. It makes it a lot easier for me to lay aside my old ideas. And so now what we're doing is we're beginning to look at where we're in history and science, where we believed one thing and then we were given sufficient evidence and changed our minds. Just like we might be asked to do about this concept of God or a higher power or a spirit of the universe. We might come and we might believe one thing, there is no God, God couldn't help me, something like that. And we change our minds. That's what we're being asked to do. And so it's going to use a lot of metaphors and a lot of examples, and we're going to be pointing to, not directly saying, but pointing to various barriers that we have to belief in a power greater than ourselves. It goes on to say, the reader may still ask why he should believe in a capital P power greater than himself. So if I'm struggling with that, man, I don't know if I can believe. Fair enough, the book is meeting us where we're at and going to take us where we need to go. And keep in mind, capital P power, we think there are good reasons. Let's have a look at some of them. And listen, this next paragraph, I always want to read in like an mid-Atlantic accent, you know, like those old-timey people. So I will for a little bit. The practical individual of today is a stickler for facts and results. You know, it feels like I should have a fedora and a little news cap thing. You know what I mean? Or I'll read it normally. That's fine too. But what we're saying is like, okay, facts and results. And if I'm coming here with that idea of like, well, God isn't factual. I can't see a power greater than myself. I can't understand intellectually a power greater than myself. So we're going to address some of those barriers. And it says, nevertheless, the 20th century readily accepts theories of all kinds, provided they are firmly grounded in fact. So we hold on to belief and we have faith in theories, provided they're reasonably grounded in fact. That's what it's saying. We have numerous theories, for example, about electricity. And I mean, listen, I'll be honest with you guys, when I was reading this by myself for the first or second or third time, this is where I'm like, what the heck does electricity have to do with God? It lost me. I'm like, who cares? Now, keep in mind, electricity was something in Bill Wilson's lifetime they didn't have, and now they have. So it was something that you could like comparatively see. Oh, I'm going to talk about Rob's Wi-Fi issues here in a second. He was having some Wi-Fi struggles at the start of the meeting. All right. So it says, we have numerous theories, for example, about electricity. everyone believes them without a murmur of doubt. Now, keep in mind, other than, I mean, you can like, you know, when you remember when you're a kid and you take like a balloon and you rub it on your head and you stick it on the wall, or you do that as an adult. There's no judgment. How you spend your Friday nights is your business. But that idea, like, yeah, I can see static electricity. Oh, we're on, awesome, welcome, we're on page 48. I'm glad you're here. So that static electricity, I can kind of see electricity. I can kind of see it in lightning, but I've never seen like electricity actually moving through the wire. So that idea of like, man, I can't see God. That's kind of what we're talking about, right? But we believe in electricity, even though we can't always have a visual eye on electricity as it's working and as it's moving. And it says everybody believes them without a murmur of doubt. Why this ready acceptance? Simply because it is impossible to explain what we see, what we feel, what we direct and use without a reasonable assumption as a starting point. So we're starting just with the idea of electricity exists, right? I maybe can't see electricity, but it exists. Just like you can't see Wi-Fi, but it exists. Now, what it's saying is, but we do see the results of electricity. In fact, we can use electricity. And we see, yeah, so we see the light is on, my computer's on, we're all here, right? So we see that result of electricity, and we can feel the result of electricity, right? We turn on a heated blanket. If we got some Christmas lights that are maybe not the most safe and they're starting to get a little hot, you can feel that. This is just my fire safety PSA in the middle of the big book study. You be careful now. And we direct that power, right? So if I want to plug in my phone, I'm going to direct that power from the outlet to my phone to charge my phone and use. And you know, it's just like that with God. It's just like that with God. So often we say, well, I don't see God. But what we begin to see is the results of God. You know, just like, if you're wondering, what is the results of God? Well, we got like 32 people who are sober today, right? That's some evidence of God. And I love, this is one of the things I love to do. I encourage my sponsees to do. Let's say you're going to the grocery store. Let's say you're driving in traffic or you're doing something you don't want to do. I always suggest, hey girl, why don't you say a prayer, invite God, and watch for God. You see, the more that I watch for that presence of that power, the more that I will see. It is incredible, some of the places that you can see God. I see God in airports all the time. I like airports. I'm a weirdo. I also enjoy the dentist. So, like, listen, please take everything I say with a grain of salt. I'm a weirdo. But that idea of like, I feel, you know, that idea of feeling God, you know, when you feel that connected and you kind of feel filled up with something else, or that feeling of joy or that feeling of lightness. Bill talks about feeling amazingly lifted up, a peace and serenity. That's what we're talking about. And use, right? I use, man. You know what it is like to show up when you're going to work with a newcomer for the first time, and maybe you're a little nervous or you're a little scared, and maybe you say a little prayer, God, guide my words, help me to say what you would have me say. And you show up and you work with the sponsee and you're like, man, that was good. Where did that come from? That wasn't me. You know what I mean? See, feel, direct, and use. I'm using this power. And you see, I am without power. I'm like a phone whose battery died, you know? Or like in Rob's case, his Wi-Fi wasn't working. You know what I mean? The Wi-Fi was still there. It was still there, but he wasn't fully connected. And what we wouldn't say is, Rob, Wi-Fi doesn't exist. It's not real. I mean, it wasn't feeling very real for him as he was popping in and out of the meeting. But what we needed to do is we needed to change our orientation and reestablish that connection to the Wi-Fi, just like we're doing here. We're reorientating ourselves to that power and establishing a connection with that power. So extra glad you're all here and extra glad Rob's Wi-Fi worked. All right. And so it says everybody, so we're using that reasonable assumption of there could be a power greater than ourselves. That's a starting point. Again, that's what step 2 is. I don't have my spiritual awakening at step 2. I just begin to believe one is possible. It goes on to say everybody nowadays believes in scores of assumptions for which there is good evidence, but no perfect visual proof. Again, that idea of, I can't see God. There must not be, I can't see God. There is no God, right? And does not science demonstrate that visual proof is the weakest proof? So scientific experiences happening based on what we can see is actually not the best proof of science. Let's imagine you pour two like clear liquids into a beaker and they create a very powerful acid that eats away at things. Man, if I got those two clear liquids in the beaker, I'm like, nothing's changed. Don't touch it. You know what I'm saying? Just because I can't see a reaction does not mean a reaction has not happened. Oh, there's that one where it's like, you don't mix bleach and ammonia. You know what I mean? You'll experience the react. Actually, I don't do that. Absolutely not. Sorry, don't do that. These separate cleaning products. God, this is really turned into like a home safety PSA. Don't mix bleach and ammonia. Just be careful with your Christmas lights. Don't start a fire, you know. While I'm there, switch the batteries in your smoke detectors if it hasn't been changed in a while. You know, that's do a little smoke, right? That's a carbon monoxide detector. Anywho, focus. Oh God. All right. So, and it says, does not science demonstrate that visual proof is the weakest proof? It is being constantly revealed as mankind studies the material world that outward appearances are not inward reality at all. And how true is that for an alcoholic? How true is that for somebody like me? The outward appearance that I'm trying to present to the world, man, that is not my inward reality, even a little bit. And, you know, like, especially when I'm in the illness, you know, I'm trying to present, it's all good, everything's fine, I'm great, happy to be here. And on the inside, I'm dying. How true is that? And it says, to illustrate the prosaic steel girder. Man, this is where it lost me again. I'm like, oh, what the heck is a prosaic steel girder? Who the heck cares? So a prosaic steel girder, that is, and prosaic, just as Rob says, means basic or average, just your run of the mill. And a steel girder is a metal I-beam. You know, keep in mind, Bill Wilson, he's in the little Hope or Honor Dealer's office across the river in New Jersey, kind of dictating the big book to Ruth Hawk. And he's seeing as New York City, those skyscrapers are being built. You know what I mean? And so he's seeing those I-beams everywhere. So those, if you've ever seen that famous picture of the iron workers sitting on that beam over the city and they're eating their lunch, what they're sitting on is an I-beam. So that prosaic steel girder is a mass of electrons whirling around each other at incredible speed. These tiny bodies are governed by precise laws. So they're run by these laws. And these laws hold true through the material world. Science tells us so. We have no reason to doubt it. Now, listen, I was like, what are we on about? So what it's saying is, I look at a prosaic steel girder, I look at a metal I-beam, and I'm like, that's stupid. That's judgmental. I'm not judging the I-beam. It's a lovely I-beam. That lovely I-beam is solid, it's unmoving, it's firm. And science says, nah, girl, no, it's not. It's not. It's made up of these tiny atoms. And these atoms are made up of protons and neutrons and electrons. And so what's circling around those atoms are these electrons, and they are spinning around crazy fast. So there's so much movement. And I'm like, okay. And in fact, there is more space between the atoms than there are atoms themselves. And I'm like, and that's how we're able to do some of that like crazy science. And I'm like, okay, I have not firsthand ever seen an atom, like I've seen pictures of them in science, but I haven't like that's an atom. Oh, look at that electron going. But I believe that. So that was an example where we as a society believed one thing, were given good evidence and changed our minds. Can I do that about this power which is God, or this power which is a power greater than yourself? And it says, when it talks about when, however, the perfectly logical assumption is suggested that underneath the material world and life as we see it, there is an And now it's going to be a lot of capitals: a capital A, capital P, capital G, capital C, capital I. An all-powerful, guiding, creative intelligence. Right there, our perverse streak comes to the service. And we're like, absolutely not. Heck no. Go away. Right? And we laboriously set out to convince ourselves it isn't so. Right? We're saying, no, absolutely not. There could not ever be. Now, keep in mind, when we're talking about these precise laws of science, if I were to take my cell phone and I were to drop it from the same height under the same conditions, it would fall at the same speed every single time and stop working reasonably quickly. But I can measure that, right? That's the science of physics. And then we can measure gravity at a consistent rate under consistent temperatures. We also have, in botany, we plant a seed, and the leaves of plants tend to grow when they're unencumbered. They tend to grow based on the Fibonacci number sequence, so they don't overlap and cover each other, and so they can get maximum sun coverage. And we can measure that. And we look at things like, if I take water, and I'm going to do this in Celsius, so I apologize to the Americans with Fahrenheit, but if I take water and I turn it to 100 degrees Celsius, depending on my altitude, it'll boil and turn to a gas at 100 degrees Celsius every single time. Now, if I take that same water molecule and I take it to 0 degrees Celsius, I know I haven't done the Fahrenheit math, it will turn to a solid every single time. There are these rules and laws and forces at work, and we're here like, no, there's nothing behind that. No. There could be nothing beyond that. They all follow these things, but no, they don't. They don't, right? And so it says we read wordy books and indulge in windy arguments, thinking we believe this universe needs no God to explain it. Were our contentions true, it would follow that life originated out of nothing, means nothing, and proceeds nowhere. And it's there's a better place in the book to talk about this, but I always like talking about this at this point, and then I think we'll do a paragraph and wrap it up. But this was my aunt, and she passed away in 2015, and she had cancer, and this is her obituary. Look at that. Now, so you can guess type A personality. If you're wondering, absolutely not hardcore on the B side of things, but type A personality. And so she graduated in a PhD. I'm just going to read some of this. So I'm not reading all of it, guys. PhD in physical chemistry. She was adjunct professor in the School of Biomedical Engineering at Dalhousie University and the Department of Chemistry at the University of Guelph. She spent years at the University of Acadia being a professor of she was just like electrochemistry, and she just knew the world at such a precise level, like electrochemistry. That was her jam. Did a lot with the food sciences. I mean, it talks about how she was she served a number of roles with the International Society of Electrochemistry. I bet they were a rockin' bunch. Woo! But all of that to say, like, this is a human being who understands the world in a way that I could absolutely never, and probably actually saw some freaking electrons with her eyeballs, like through a telescope, obviously, not telescope, microscope. Telescope's the other way. Telescope up, microscope down. Safety. Put on a seatbelt. I don't know. That's what this study has been. And so she was diagnosed with cancer, and she knew she was going to die. And being type A, she planned out her whole funeral. She planned out this whole funeral card, and in it, and I just found this so interesting. She has the Lord is my shepherd, and be still my soul. And I always think, man, if somebody like that, who is that smart, can believe in a power greater than herself, who am I to say absolutely not? I'm a wet pants, pissing myself behind the dumpster, smoking crack sort of person. Who am I to say there is no God, right? And it goes on to say, instead of regarding ourselves as intelligent agents, spearheads of God's ever advancing creation, capital C as in a verb. And I love that idea of God, higher power, creator, spirit of the universe as a present tense verb. God is happening and moving and active in the here and now. We agnostics and atheists chose to believe that our human intelligence was the last word, the alpha and the omega, the beginning and end of all. Rather vain of us, wasn't it? That idea that my intelligence is the last word. Goodness, my intelligence isn't the last. I can barely put sentences together most days. I promise you, it is not. And then we just had something in the chat 22 times in chapter 4, we agnostics, is the term reason used with all its immediate guises, i.e. reasons, unreasoning, reasonableness. There must be a reason for that. That's Scott's pun. I'm going to give him credit for that pun. So thank you all guys for coming. I'm going to stop the recording. We'll wrap up with the prayer and kick it off where we left off next week, where we left it off this week. See, I can't be my intelligence can't be the alpha and the omega. I can't finish a sentence. Anywho, rock and roll.